Edmund Husserl was a German-Czech philosopher. He was actually from Moravia. He began in mathematics, and everything I say should keep in mind that his primary love and his primary interest was always mathematics. And he got into philosophy by way of an interest in the philosophy of arithmetic, or we would say the foundations of arithmetic. What makes an arithmetical formula true? In philosophy, Husserl became important because he invented a method. It's a method which is called phenomenology, and his intention was to find a foundation for all knowledge. What he meant by a foundation was something that was itself unquestionable, absolutely provable, something which was beyond any doubt. In a philosophical sense, it consisted of necessary truths, and arithmetic, mathematics in general, consist of necessary truths. Perhaps Husserl is most famous in philosophy because of his influence, because his philosophy itself is fairly technical and, as I say, mainly directed towards questions that most philosophers haven't worried a lot about. In particular, Heidegger was a student of his, and Heidegger's philosophy has come to dominate a good deal of the 20th century, and there is no question but that Heidegger at least began and got his start from Husserl's work in phenomenology. Jean-Paul Sartre heard of Husserl at an early age. Husserl gave a famous set of lectures in Paris in the late 30s, and Sartre too began his career as a phenomenologist, and his first great work was quite explicitly a work of phenomenology. Husserl came to phenomenology by a number of different routes, but first and foremost, let's mention that in his studies of arithmetic, he began as a strict empiricist. He followed a German author named Karl Stumpf, but in American English terms, I think the philosopher that would be closest to his views was John Stuart Mill. Mill, a very strict empiricist, had argued that mathematics and arithmetic was really a matter of very well-confirmed empirical judgment, drawn from our experiences of counting. Husserl took up this idea and defended it in his first book, but it was very quickly and badly reviewed by the great German logician Gottlob Frege, who pointed out to Husserl that really this idea wasn't plausible at all, that arithmetic, whatever else it might be, could not be a matter of empirical truth. Husserl did something which not many philosophers do, certainly not in public, but he changed his mind. He turned around 150 degrees and instead decided that arithmetic must be defended, and generalizing the idea, knowledge in general must be defended on a bedrock of necessary truths which could not be reduced to empirical truth. There's a negative side of his philosophy too. He opposed a good many trends of the time. In particular, he was opposed to 4 questions. The idea of relativism, the question whether, in fact, truth is relative to a time or a place or a people. Nietzsche was perhaps the most notorious relativist that Husserl would have heard of, also a German philosopher named Wilhelm Dilthey. But they had argued in various ways that there was a very real question whether knowledge was always perspectival, whether it depended on who you were and how you saw things from what position and so on. Whereas what Husserl wants to say is knowledge, at least at its foundations, must not be perspectival, but must be simply true. He also objected to skepticism, which had acquired a dominant place in Enlightenment thought. One might trace it back to the Greeks in one sense, but back to Descartes and his method of doubt. Most famously, it can be traced back to David Hume. Skepticism is the view that we cannot know what the world is like. Or, even if you allow that we know what the world is like, we cannot know that we know what the world is like. Husserl also opposes historicism, which one might think of as a special variant of relativism. Historicism is the view that truth and knowledge are relative to a particular historical period or epoch. So one might look back to, say, the 12th century and note that people then thought that the earth was flat. And one might say that was true for them. Of course, most philosophers now would say this is a poor locution. It might be a way of saying something like it was justified on the basis of the evidence they had, or given their faulty reasoning, it was what they believed. But it makes no sense to say it was true for them and it's not true now. Historicism, a view that truth is relative to time, is something that Husserl will not take at face value either. Finally, there's positivism, which was a major movement in the middle of the 19th century, and Husserl was certainly very aware of it. It's closely akin to the kind of empiricism that he once accepted himself. Positivism, put in its crudest form, says, look at the facts. There are only facts. What Husserl objects to is the fact that from facts you cannot get any notion of necessity. That mathematics in particular, as he had been convinced, mathematics could not be based on the facts of the case, however that was construed. And in general, all four of those views, relativism, skepticism, historicism, and positivism, were a kind of naturalism. And one way to put what they share in common was they all tried to explain the mind in terms of nature, in terms of science, in terms of causal processes. Whereas what Husserl wants to point out is it's in terms of the mind that nature and our knowledge of nature must be explained. And that requires a notion of certainty, a notion of foundations, a basis on which to build our sense of causality, our sense of the material world, our sense of everything that science and common sense knowledge has to offer. The pursuit of certainty is certainly nothing new in philosophy. It goes back to the Greeks, and Plato is certainly a strong example of it. It goes back to Descartes. As I said, Descartes looked at the hallmark of his system. What he sought was to find certainty through his method of doubt. Doubt everything until you can prove it beyond a doubt. It goes back to Kant, who also, challenging Hume's skepticism, wanted to find a way of justifying first principles, a way of trying to show what the rules of the mind, what was necessary for any possible belief to be true, must look like. This is the Archimedean point that Husserl is looking for, a place where he can rest his thesis, say, this we know for sure, and then build from that to show what else we might know as well. Later in his philosophy, he gives a name to this Archimedean point. It is the transcendental ego. It was, in many ways, similar to Descartes' notion of subjectivity. It was, like Descartes, a method, not a method of doubt, but nevertheless a method of somehow getting at what was in consciousness, what was in the ego, and using that as a basis. When Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, this for him is supposed to be the absolutely necessary first principle from which he can derive all of the other things he wants to prove. In Husserl, it's a bit more complicated. In fact, it's a lot more complicated. But the idea of a method through which one will retreat to consciousness, retreat to the mind, retreat to the self, the ego, is one which really forms the basis of his entire philosophy. The idea of subjectivity is rather complicated. On the one hand, subjectivity can refer simply to the first-person standpoint. It can refer more generally to personal opinions, perhaps personal opinions which haven't yet been proven or even can't be proven. Subjectivity can refer to one's particular biases, prejudices, emotional proclivities. Subjectivity in philosophy often refers to a realm. And Descartes certainly talks about the realm of consciousness. Husserl talks about the realm of consciousness. And when he expands this idea into the idea of the transcendental ego, it always has a kind of quasi-spatial metaphor at the basis of it, something which I think is very hard to avoid in common sense talk, and in philosophy one can seriously question whether this common sense metaphor should be applied there as well. But in any case, what's clear in Husserl is that the idea of looking at what's in consciousness, the contents of consciousness, is the basis of his phenomenology. He rejects Descartes' notion of doubt. Yet he maintains something very critical to Descartes, namely, whatever it is we are to prove must be proven on the basis of things which are evident to us. That's phenomenology. Now there's an ambiguity here. Might be put in a number of different ways, but certainly the central idea is the truth is given to us through intuition. And the key word here is given. To say that something is given is to say that it's not a matter of interpretation, it's not a matter of construction, certainly not a matter of making it up, but in a sense, consciousness here is passive, consciousness receives. And by the way, the notion of intuition here shouldn't be taken as a sort of generic notion of any experience, much less sense data whatsoever. Rather, the notion of intuition is a very special notion that Husserl makes up, borrowed from a long line in philosophy, in which intuitions are opposed to normal experiences, and in particular experiences of facts. One might trace it back to the concept of nous in the Greeks, where Plato, for example, used it as a word referring to what is sometimes translated as intellectual intuition, a special kind of intuition. On the other hand, instead of the truth in the world being given to us through intuition, it might be that the world is constituted by consciousness. The notion of constitution, of course, comes straight from Kant, and it has a very strong active element. The idea is that it's not just a question of seeing what the world is like, but it's a question of, in different interpretations, setting up the world, framing the world, even creating the world out of one's experience. Some of Kant's more radical followers, for example, took that last interpretation, the idea that we create the world through our experience, as being essential to their philosophies. This is much too strong for Husserl, and as I say, one of Husserl's virtues or vices, depending on how you look at it, is that the notion of the world as given and the notion of the world as constituted are in tension throughout his philosophy. And I think the way to understand this is to say that it's something of both, and maybe the distinction, as philosophers have normally played with that, since Kant in particular, is not really very helpful. In any case, the result is going to be necessary and not merely contingent truth. The debate between realism, whether what we see is the world as it is, and idealism, the idea that somehow what we see are the result of our own ideas, is something that Husserl wants to bypass. And I think he would say to the question, are you a realist or an idealist, is that the question itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So too Kant wanted to say that when he talked about the world as a scientist, as a human being, he was certainly a realist, but when he talked about the world from a philosophical sort of meta position, then he was an idealist. But the question about whether the world itself should be construed in terms of realism or idealism, that question wouldn't ultimately make any sense. What Husserl wants to do is give us a concept of experience, give us a concept of the way the world appears to us, give us a concept of the world as phenomenon, in which he can analyze essentially what the structures, or in Kant's terms, what the rules of engagement might be. How does the world become available to us? How does it take on the structures it has? And here the question whether they are given to us or whether they are constituted by us is probably an unanswerable question. Husserl doesn't try to answer it. Instead, what he tries to do is to give us simply a description of the way the world appears. Let me give you a fast example about how this is supposed to work. Suppose I ask you to look at the bowl on the lectern beside me. There's a sense in which you simply see it. In that sense, you might say, the bowl is simply given to your experience through your senses. But now if you think for a second, you don't really see the bowl. What you see is the bowl from a perspective. Now here, Nietzsche, of course, would jump in and say, of course, you only see anything from perspectives, and usually one perspective at a time, unless you're a cubist. But here, Husserl wants to say, no, it's not just a question of seeing one perspective at a time, but rather when you see the bowl as not only the thing that you see, but a thing that has, for example, a backside which you don't see. And it would be simply false to say that what you perceive is just the bowl from a perspective in which all you see is the front side, because you would be very surprised if you were to walk around and notice that, in fact, it's just a facade of a bowl and it doesn't have another side. There's a sense in which when you see something, the description of your experience is a description not of just what I think we would call a snapshot, but it's a description of a very complicated set of concepts through which we see something that has many sides, something which I presume, although I haven't touched it, has a certain kind of texture, something which has a certain weight, and all of this is somehow built into that experience itself. Now, what Husserl wants to do is he wants to give an analysis of experience which brings in all of those different factors and say what we see is not simply what's given to us, but obviously when I see the bowl, what I'm bringing to it is a whole host of presuppositions and concepts which make it much richer than what is simply given could possibly be. So the question is, how do I examine consciousness and how do I examine experience in this way? And the key for Husserl, especially in his early works, is what he calls the phenomenological reduction. In a way, the phrase is misleading because through Husserl's works, and even in his early works, what he gives us is a number of different reductions, and they have different purposes. And I'm going to basically describe two of them to you, although in his various works these are sometimes blended together in various ways. The first, which he defended in his early years, roughly 1905, 1910 or so, is what he calls, after the Greek, an epoche. The word means suspension, and the sort of popular characterization of it is it's a way of bracketing. And in particular, when we perform this phenomenological epoche, or phenomenological reduction, what we do is we bracket out the world in an important sense. More accurately, what we bracket out are causal relations. Or, more importantly, what we bracket out is our common sense understanding that what we see is caused by the sense, what we see is the result of our sense organs being bombarded by stimuli, and then somehow from the sense impressions we infer that there's an object there. Now notice, that's a two worlds kind of view where what I'm doing is I am inferring on the basis of what's happening inside my consciousness what the world outside must be like. What Husserl says is the first thing we have to do is get rid of all such notions. This is precisely the kind of mind as a consequence of nature philosophy that he wants to reject. Rather, if I take a look at the bowl, what becomes evident to Husserl is that there's a sense in which I see the bowl quite regardless of what's causing it. To take a rather perverse way of thinking about this, there are philosophers in the past, and Descartes may be a candidate, but Leibniz and Berkeley are certainly both clear examples of philosophers who would say that my experience of the bowl is not necessarily about a bowl being out there, but my experiences of the bowl may be just ideas planted in my head by God, who plants all ideas and is ultimately the arbiter of all of our experiences. Or to be just more reasonable about it, but not much more, I might say what seems to me to be a bowl, in fact, is a hologram. And the causal sequence would be very different. Or more absurd still, I may be hallucinating, and I only think I see a bowl. And yet there's a sense in which the hallucination, the hallucinated bowl, is the same as the bowl that would actually be there if there's a bowl there. Or if I now take a nap and I dream about the bowl that I've been talking about for the last 3 minutes, there's a sense in which the bowl that I dream of will be the same bowl as the bowl that's sitting there. Now, what Husserl is saying is basically, it doesn't make any description, doesn't make any difference in terms of my description of the bowl and my description of the scene of the bowl, whether it is a genuine bowl whether it is a bowl sort of stimulated in my consciousness by God, whether it is a hallucinated bowl or a holographic bowl, or whether, for that matter, it's a dreamt of bowl. There's a sense in which my experiencing of the bowl is the same in each case. So the first reduction, the epoche, basically says, don't pay attention to the reality of the bowl. Don't pay attention to the sense in which a material bowl causes you to have certain experiences. Just pay attention to the experience itself. Just describe what that's all about. Later on, when he starts talking more about the transcendental ego and less about consciousness, he raises to the center of the thesis the notion of what he calls an eidetic reduction. Again, this is a treat to the Greek, Plato in particular. The Greek word for what's usually translated as form or idea is the Greek word eidos. In more modern terminology, we might think of it as the essence of things. When we look at our consciousness, having performed the first reduction, so we're just looking at consciousness and not at the world, we then try and figure out what the essential features of our experience might be. So in my experience of the bowl, for example, it is part of my essential experience of the bowl as a material object that I see that it is a thing with a backside, it is a thing with mass, it is a thing in space. And all of this is not just particular to this perception of the bowl, but this is essential to any experience of a material object whatsoever. Husserl has a slogan, which he says, back to the things themselves. I've always found this exceedingly confusing, especially to my students, because there's a sense in which, if we think about things as the bowl, that's exactly what we're not doing. But what he really means is back to the experience itself, back to the basic intuitions, back to the essential structures of those intuitions through which we can understand what knowledge is all about. So the idea is to go back to the idea of the mind, back to the idea of consciousness, back to the idea that what we know, what we experience, has to be based on certain kinds of rules, certain kinds of structures, in any case, certain kinds of essences, which are common to all experience. And what phenomenology tries to do is to isolate those. Towards the end of his career, in the 1930s, Husserl shifted gears somewhat again. And I should add, before I go on, that Husserl was shifting gears all the time. Just as he rather heroically changed his mind when his early theory about arithmetic was soundly refuted by Frege, and he changed his whole orientation in philosophy, so too he was always revising his philosophy and revising what phenomenology amounted to and revising the methodological procedures that he was encouraging. So much so that giving a simple lecture on Husserl is always, in a way, plagued by the fact that every year or so there would be a somewhat different philosophy to talk about. Anyway, in 1930, he took a fairly radical shift. The radical shift may have been due to the already now popular work of his best student, Martin Heidegger. But in any case, what he started to see was that the philosophy he had talked about, particularly in terms of mathematics itself as a paradigm, was too limited. When I gave you, for example, the description of a perceptual experience, a perception of a bowl, that doesn't quite jive, at least it certainly doesn't fit very easily with the sorts of things that one would talk about if one's answering the original Husserlian question, what makes an arithmetical formula, say 2 + 2 = 4, true? They're obviously going to be very different in nature. But as he started being more and more concerned with questions like the phenomenology of perception, he started to realize that he was, again, leaving out an awful lot. It's not enough to see an object in terms of, for example, it's having a backside, it's having a mass, and so on. But there's something that Husserl had barely talked about in most of his career that he comes to realize is absolutely essential to absolutely essential to knowledge. And that is shared experience. Now, in a sense, of course, this is precisely the sort of thing that relativists and historicists in particular had always talked about. One might even say that it's shared experience that makes something true for them. And Husserl certainly was not going to go after any such thesis in his own philosophy. Nevertheless, the question, how is it that what I see, how is it that my experiences are shared by other people, is a question which he had never really addressed. Insofar as one weighs towards the given side of the Husserl equation, one might simply say, well, what's given to me is given to others as well. But nevertheless, there's a kind of skeptical question, how do I know about the others, and how do I know about their experience? Insofar as you weigh towards the constitutive side of the Husserl question, then of course it becomes more difficult. How do I know that the way I constitute objects is the way other people constitute objects? But rather than give in to this kind of skepticism, Husserl confronts it head on. In one of his best-known books, a book based on a series of Paris lectures he gave in the late 20s, he publishes Cartesian Meditations, in which he makes quite explicit reference to Descartes, says how indebted he is to Descartes' basic retreat to subjectivity and Descartes' notion of method. But he also takes on the question which Descartes himself did not really take on, about how we know there are other people, and more importantly for his purposes, how we know that the structures of experience which he describes in his own experience are in fact going to be shared by other humans. Now, in a sense, this is already answered by the idea that what you're doing is describing the essential structures of experience, describing the essences of human experience. Because if something is an essence, it's not just an essence for me, it's an essence for anyone. But nevertheless, there's this nagging question. How do you know there are other anyones to have those experiences? And how do you know that they, in fact, have the same kind of consciousness that you do? Well, Husserl never completely answers this question, but what he comes to see is that there's a shared background that we all have. And there are all sorts of presuppositions, which themselves really can't count as rules or structures of consciousness, but nevertheless enter into our concepts of knowledge, perceptual knowledge in particular, throughout. He calls this the Lebenswelt, the lived world. And the idea is, first of all, that knowledge has dimension, which he had not talked about in his earlier work, partly because of the paradigm of mathematics. And in particular, it has to do with human practices and how people participate in their experience and participate together. It is something less than the kind of pragmatic turn, which will happen very soon after, and it was already happening in America, in which practices become the central focus of philosophy. And it's certainly not quite where Heidegger is about to take phenomenology, where practices become the essence of phenomenology itself. But what I think we can find in Husserl's later work is a kind of recognition that the mathematical paradigm with which he began is not adequate. And instead, what he needs is a broader concept of experience, and that is where his students are going to take us.